All right, today we have another episode from the archives with one of my incredible guests. Enjoy. All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson, and I'm very excited to introduce my guest today, Dr. Karen Treisman. Karen, welcome, and are you ready to go?
I am. Thank you so much for having me.
You are welcome. Dr. Treisman is a London-based, highly specialized clinical psychologist. She's worked in the NHS and children's services for several years and has also worked cross-culturally in both Africa and Asia with groups ranging from former child soldiers to survivors of the Rwandan Genocide. Karen has extensive experience in the areas of trauma, parenting, and attachment, and works clinically using a range of therapeutic approaches with families, systems, and children in or on the edge of care, unaccompanied asylum-seeking young people and adopted children. She's a director of Safe Hands and Thinking Minds, and I'll have that linked up at the show notes page, as well as the author of the book, Working with Relational and Developmental Trauma in Children and Adolescents. Karen, welcome. Thanks so much for taking the time to do this.
Thank you.
All right. So tell our listeners a little bit about where you're from, where you're calling from, and then let's get going.
Yeah, so I am currently sitting in my flat in central London in England. Can probably pick up the accent. So yeah, from the other side of the globe at the moment.
And are you from there?
I am, yes. Okay. I am from London. Yeah, I was sort of brought up in lots of different parts of Africa. My parents are South African. But yes, I was predominantly sort of brought up in London.
Nice. So let's start out here as we do with a quote, an excerpt, a sentence, whatever, something, Karen, to kind of set the tone for what is about to come in this interview. What do you have for us?
Yeah, sure. There were so many different ones whirling around in my mind, but I guess one which I think encompasses a lot of the work I do is to say relational trauma requires relational repair. And I guess by that, what I really mean by it is I think, the children that I work with and so many of us have worked with have experienced within the context of their relationships trauma, whether that's been relational poverty, whether that's been, in neglect, domestic violence, sexual abuse. So I think it's all about thinking about how can we keep relationships at the heart of what we do, whether that's that moment-to-moment interactions or that more therapeutic relationship. But I think it's really sort of true to how do we give children a different way of doing and being in relationships? How can we create for them a second chance secure base, a second chance safe haven, and sort of to quote my website, how do we keep them in safe hands and thinking minds?
Yeah, I love that quote. And, we often talk about that specific type of trauma on this podcast, but I've never heard it put so succinctly, kind of the relationship between the trauma and the treatment or care in those terms. And I love it. And you're just, I read a snippet of your bio, and your experience is really interesting, varied, and pretty inspiring. Let's jump right in. How did you get into this field?
Wow. Goodness. I guess sort of personally, because I think we all, we don't come to this work by coincidence. We've all got sort of a story. So I think personally, sort of intergenerationally, trauma and survivorship's a real thread and script in my family. So my grandparents were survivors of the Holocaust. My parents were raised in apartheid South Africa. And my mum has had for over 20 years multiple sclerosis. So I think that sort of avenue of trauma and survivorship's been really really strong. And then I guess mirroring and marrying to that a lot of my childhood, and also pre and post qualifying as a psychologist, I've spent loads of time in Africa and Asia, and so I think I've seen lots of human rights injustices, lots of different areas like HIV, survivors of the Rwandan Genocide, that sort of really made me love this sort of work and be quite dedicated. And I guess sort of professionally, I guess I've been really lucky to work with some phenomenal, inspiring clients, but also have some amazing supervisors and colleagues. But throughout training, we had lots of different placements, whether it was in learning disability or anxiety or youth offending services. And what I was really struck by was I felt that trauma was a common theme and sort of thread joining all of them. So I guess that's where I sort of came around getting into that work.
Now, let me just interject. So, I mean, your experience is certainly one thing, but what was it about that experience that kind of propelled you into the field? And why do you think you were drawn to working with traumatized kids and so forth?
I think so many different things. I think I felt like I wanted to be able to have an opportunity to intervene at an early stage, because I'd seen different stages in the lifespan, whether that was in adult mental health services, forensic services, that I thought, goodness, I wish we could just go back to that sort of early parent-child relationship and really try and sort of bring attachment and trauma into that. I think within the work, it combines lots of the things I love, from sort of being able to work creatively, the mind-body link, kind of human rights elements, trauma elements. So I think that really sort of drew me to the work as well. And just thinking what a difference it can make when you sort of train or educate societies and communities about trauma and attachment, and how hopefully that can then change a child's trajectory.
Was it kind of a no-brainer for you to get into the field? I mean, do you feel that you had, going into it, a particular affinity for or proclivity for working with with trauma?
Absolutely, yeah. From a really, really young age, I wanted to work, but mainly from my experiences of, I suppose, being in Africa and my grandparents from the Holocaust and my parents in South Africa. I always, from a very young age, I always thought I would specialise in working with refugee and asylum-seeking people. The children in care sort of developed more because I had lots of placements in that area. But I went in to do my doctorate with the intention of working in trauma in some way. What was it, or is it about you, do you think, that enables you or helps you do that type of work? That's a good question. I think there is... I hope that I have an ability to build and engage relationships and to see sort of people's inner child, I guess. And in many ways, I feel like to be able to do this work, you have to be able to build that relationship with lots of different people. So I feel that was something that I myself was held in very safe hands, thinking minds, as a child, and was very fortunate to have very enriched environments and very positive relational experiences with my parents. And I think there was a sense of me wanting to sort of share and ground and give that. And I think that was a huge thing. But also at heart, in many ways, I guess I'm sort of an artist and creative. And so I think there's something about being able to take some of the best and worst of human nature, but be able to sort of bring some of my creative ways of working with people to try and contribute to the field, I guess. Nice. Appreciate that. So let's talk about kind of an early clinical era. I mean, obviously you've had a lot of experience across an array of different settings. Share with our listeners, Karen, an early era and kind of how that impacted you, what you learned from it. Yeah. I guess sort of on a more general, I can think of a really specific example, but I think on a general one, sort of went during my training and for probably a couple of years afterwards, I really didn't know very much at all about the impact of trauma and disrupted attachments on the body, on the sort of structure and function and architecture of the brain, on sensory experience. So I think just in general, my interpretations, my observations, my interventions were really based on talking, and sort of I excluded a lot of the more sensory body-based creative things. So I think that was sort of a more general big thing about sort of widening my toolkit and getting more of that knowledge. But sort of a specific one that comes to mind that I always talk to my trainees about is I had a young woman come into my therapy room during training, and she was smiling, but she reported to me that she was pregnant. And my instant response at that time was to say, "Oh, congratulations." And she then sort of had a startled look and said to me, "I was raped." And I think in that moment, obviously, I felt horrific. But absolutely in that moment, I had just let my own biases and lens and experience of pregnancy being a positive thing come across and say, they took over. And I guess that was a really big learning experience for me, and a scary and sad one at the same time. But I guess it really homed in that point that we all learn in training, but it's different in the room, about not making assumptions and, taking that position of curiosity and thinking before you speak.
Yeah. And I think even though that is a somewhat, extreme example in terms of rape, I think that maintaining that curiosity is huge. And I think that's such a great kind of nugget takeaway for our listeners. My God. So what happened? I mean, did you work with this individual over the course of a period of time? Were you able to smooth things out in a sense?
Yeah, thankfully. So I guess I was able to try and make use of that moment. So I think I mean, this is years ago, but I think I said something around, I'm really sorry and I need to take ownership of my response, but I wonder if what just happened in the room is something that's been happening a lot in your life and in society and in your day-to-day world. And what does that feel like, and how can we think about that and make sense of it? So I sort of managed to rescue it slightly in that moment.
Well, I think that sounds like the perfect textbook, recover in a sense.
I hope so. It didn't feel like it at the time, but yeah. I tried. But yeah, we actually worked together for, it was during a placement during the doctorate. So I think that was for a further sort of 4 or 5 months on a weekly basis. Actually sort of did some really positive work together.
So let's talk about your work, your site, Safe Hands, Thinking Minds, and that is Safe Hands, Thinking Minds, all one word, .co.uk. Again, I'll have this linked up in the show notes page at thetraumatherapistpodcast.com. So talk to us about this. Go. I guess what it's really about is offering training, talking at conferences, workshops, consultation on areas around attachment, trauma, parenting, specialist groups such as unaccompanied asylum-seeking young people, or youth offending young people, or children in care, we call it here in the UK, looked after children. And I guess it sort of came about from so often I was going within my different jobs and doing training around thinking about the impact of relational trauma for foster carers, or talking to journalists about vicarious trauma. And it just felt like being able to sort of spread that message of attachment and trauma, but doing
sort of trainings in a way that were really interactive, that were using lots of video clips and metaphors and experiential exercises, was sort of incredibly rewarding, but also having a really big ripple effect. So I guess I decided, in addition to my full-time job, to set up this organization that, you know, companies from 4 or 5 people through to several thousand people can tap into that, and sort of both have some packages, but also some tailor-made courses around trauma and attachment.
So you, in addition to your full-time job, you started this.
Yes.
Wow.
I did.
Now, what,
yeah,
I mean, this is such a huge undertaking. Again, I mean, there seems to be this thread of what? Just you have this kind of, I don't know, for lack of a better expression, this kind of tenacity in the way you approach. And I mean that in the best way. I mean, to start this organization is huge. How did you go about doing it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess it was really a bit of a sort of word of mouth ripple effect. So I was sort of given a couple of opportunities by colleagues who had maybe worked with me in one job, and they would ask me to come and talk to just a small group of, 10, 15 foster carers, for example, about something. And then I was getting so much positive feedback, but also I was getting so much out of it. I was coming out of that day feeling so refueled, re-energized, and just buzzing that I thought, my goodness, I want to do this more. And actually, I can sort of spread the message around attachment and trauma so much wider than having an individual therapy session. And then so I was trying to be very proactive in terms of going to conferences, going to workshops, using social media, and lots of the things had to do voluntary or free. Started sort of writing lots of journals or papers or blogs. And then just after that really started building up and sort of snowballing from there, I guess.
And the book, Working with Relational and Developmental Trauma in Children and Adolescents, when did that come about? How did that come about?
So that came about, I was actually in the States a few years ago at the Attached conference, which was a brilliant conference. And I ran sort of 3 different workshops. And when I came back to the UK, I had some interest from Routledge, the publishers, about whether I'd be interested in putting some of my experiences and training events into a book. So I was incredibly honoured and felt a bit overwhelmed, and can I do this? It's a big undertaking, a bit of an imposter. But actually, I have to say it was one of I'm actually working my second book now. So
congratulations.
Thank you. I guess that says how much I loved it. It was incredibly, a lot of sacrifice, a lot of hard work, a lot of blood, sweat and tears. The laptop was going to get thrown out the window on many occasions. But yeah, I'm really sort of proud of it. And I really hope that, again, it can spread the message to wider audiences who can't get to a conference or can't afford to get an in-house training event. So give us a kind of
nutshell, if you will, synopsis of the book.
Yeah. So in essence, it starts with sort of several chapters going on the impact of relational and developmental trauma on children's brains, on children's bodies, on their relationships, on their behaviours and on their emotions. And then I've got a chapter on sort of thinking on the other side of trauma, so the resilience and strengths and hope. I've got a chapter on how to sort of assess from a trauma and attachment basis children. Then I've got a chapter that talks about a whole range of different therapeutic interventions, trauma and attachment based. And then it goes into chapters on specialist sort of sub-client groups. So things like unaccompanied asylum-seeking young people, attachment in the classroom, young offenders, young mothers, and also a couple of chapters on self-care, stress management, and working within a traumatized organisation like social services. Right. And I guess it really, I've tried to do it. Obviously, it is an academic book for practitioners, but I've tried to really integrate lots of theory, but also lots of practical top tips, reflective exercises, metaphors, illustrations, case studies.
So it sounds like it'd be a really good book for our listeners in a sense.
I hope so. Yes, they are certainly my intended audience. I tried to write it so that also, social workers or teachers or even some parents or adopted parents, foster carers, there's something. But yeah, absolutely. The main people I wrote it for was trainee therapists or people in the trauma industry. I guess where it came from was when I was getting into this work, I literally used to read hundreds of books that sort of had so many different elements. So I wanted a book that was the book that I wish I would have had after my training.
Nice. There's so many questions I want to ask you, and I'm excited to get to your kind of advice for early stage clinicians. But before we do that, talk to us about why you keep doing this work. What drives you? What's your why for this work, Karen?
I guess just similar to what I said before, just in terms of, I think I have this huge passion about spreading the word of attachment and trauma, not just to individuals, but to families and societies and communities, to make us as a society more trauma and attachment aware. And I think I've got this real sense that, if we do that and sort of create these more enriched environments, these more trauma and attachment sensitive and aware environments, I think that will have a huge ripple effect on public health, mental health, our prison population. So I think that's a huge bit. And I guess also for me, there's something about, even though this work can be very overwhelming, very triggering, very heavy, there's something also about the other side of being so struck by sort of the human spirit and survivorship and strength. And I think partly I like to soak that in. It gives me a real sort of faith in human spirit, but also I really want to find a way to sort of honor and celebrate and build on people who've experienced that strengths and skills and what they can bring.
Yeah. You talked about, this kind of self-nourishment in a sense, that oftentimes a challenging aspect of this. How do you deal with that? And what was, I'm imagining that there have been periods in your career, in your life, where things have been pretty difficult with regards to the work you've been doing. What was that like, and how did you work through that?
Yeah, absolutely. I've definitely had lots of different times, chunks, moments where my sort of self-care has certainly narrowed or been crushed or been challenged. And equally environments where I felt quite crushed or unsupported. So there's definitely been a huge amount of variety, and including sort of in Africa and places where I was really working as a lone clinician and didn't have that sort of network of support around me. So I think that can be incredibly difficult. I guess loads of different things that I've done in terms of self-care and stress management. I think I do practice what I preach a lot of the time. So, with young people, I make things like regulating sensory boxes or having a safe place pillow or doing relaxation exercises. And I do have all of those things myself. I think a huge thing for me is my support system. I feel like I've got a phenomenal personal support system, but also a really good professional system. And that's not just in my day-to-day work. That's been through Twitter, through LinkedIn, through going to conferences, arming myself with as much sort of knowledge as possible, but also just having me and my identity and not just having my career be my whole master identity. So, making sure that I go on lots of holidays and travels and doing things that I love, like art and nurturing activities. And also really trying to mark, celebrate and internalize some of the really positive experiences in the work, sort of what drives me, and holding those clients that I've really seen a difference or seen work forward, and just try to really sort of remind myself about why I do what I do and what keeps me going.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's such an inspiration for those of us who are listening. I mean, I love the way you talk about the kind of beautiful side of this work, watching our clients grow and improve and yet there's that other side to it that often comes along with it inevitably. But I think what I'm hearing you say, Karen, is that you seem to really appreciate and understand the wholeness of this work. I mean, when you started talking about the different things you do for self-care, and it reminded me of one of my earliest interviews, which was with Linda Curran, who is a pretty well-known clinician here, and she just listed off all these things that she really did to take care of herself. And I think, I'll speak for myself personally, I find it really difficult to keep self-nourishment and self-care there. It's Absolutely. So easy for it to, there's so many dishes in the sink or the kids, whatever.
Yeah, but it is. It's so hard. And I think it can get neglected a huge amount, doesn't it? So you have to sort of keep it at the forefront, but also I guess have those other people who can recognize it in you and remind you. And I always say to the foster carers or adopted parents I work with, you can't keep filling children's glasses up. Something or someone has to fill up your glass so that you've got enough to replenish theirs and keep on replenishing theirs. Nice.
What is some bits of advice here for people just getting into this field, for our listeners, a lot of whom are, early stage clinicians, maybe even therapists who maybe don't think they've worked with clients who've experienced trauma and, want to start getting into that education. What would you say to them?
Wow, so many things. It's, I guess, just building from what we just said, how important self-care and stress management is. I'm sure that's something everyone says, but, particularly thinking about your own triggers and your own emotional hotspots. And when working in traumatized organizations, just really thinking about how you are going to sustain and replenish and nourish yourself and the support systems around you. That feels really important. Also, I think sort of just trying to get as big a toolbox as you can. So it's kind of what I was saying before about when I started, I wasn't really aware of the body-based approaches, the sensory-based approaches, the creative-based approaches. And I think sort of having gone on lots of different trainings and speaking to lots of people and reading lots of books, it does help you to feel like you've got lots of different tools in your box. Doesn't give all the answers and doesn't mean there's times when you don't know what you're doing, but I think it certainly gives some sort of sense of support.
For someone, go ahead.
No, I just think there's something about holding that position of curiosity, and trying to hold on to always that the client is the expert of their experience as well, and that they're bringing a huge amount that you can learn from them, and it's a reciprocal relationship, and that actually they are the expert of their own experience. I think that's a really important thing to hold true, that it's not being mindful of those power dynamics. It's not just us doing something to them. And that feels even more important in the context of trauma, where so many children have felt out of control and powerless and helpless and hopeless, that there is a sense of providing mastery and also learning from them.
In terms of trauma education, trauma-informed interventions and so forth, what would you say to someone who's like, all right, there's so many books, so many workshops, so many conferences, where do I start? Do I need to read, or should I read just a wide variety? What about focusing? What about specializing? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah. It's difficult, isn't it? Because I think everyone's sort of learning style and minds work differently. And some people love to be really niche and specialist in a particular area, and some people really like to have a more general area. Personally, I found it really helpful to read lots of different avenues about trauma and then home in onto something that particularly fit with my personality or my interests. So, for example, the more body-based and sensory and art-based things. But also, I always find that it becomes more alive when you're working with a client. Yeah. And so I think I did a lot of that if I was working with a client who was a looked after child presenting with nightmares, that's where I would sort of home in so that it would really become a bit more alive.
Nice. Okay, so once again, your site is Safe Hands and Thinking Minds. That'll be linked up at the show notes page, as well as Karen's book, Working with Relational and Developmental Trauma in Children and Adolescents. Karen, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Lots of different ways. So I'm on Twitter. I'm under there as Dr. Karen Treisman. So I'm really active on Twitter. I've also got a Facebook page, which is called Safe Hands and Thinking Minds. I'm on LinkedIn under Dr. Karen Treisman. So yeah, any of those ways. And I'm really happy to sort of talk to people, learn from people, make connections. I think I'm always keen to sort of expand my personal and professional support system as well.
Okay. And in terms of a go-to book, what would you share?
Wow, goodness. You should see my library. I guess anything by Bruce Perry, Peter Levine, Van der Kolk, I would hugely recommend. But I guess I'll sort of list just a few that maybe are less well known that I think have been really helpful. So one it's called Neurobiologically Informed Trauma Therapy with Children. It's by someone called Linda Chapman. Really powerful, informative book. Then there's The Child Survivor, Healing Developmental Trauma by Joanna Silberg, which again is a brilliant book, particularly around disassociation, which feels really prevalent in this sort of client group. And then Creative Interventions for Traumatized Children by the brilliant Kathy Malchody. And I guess also anything by Pat Ogden, but particularly her sensory motor psychotherapy books. I think they're fantastic to think about more the body and the sensory world.
Awesome. I think that'll get people going. It'll give them a good start. All those books are awesome. I'll have them linked up. Karen, it's been awesome. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, and I just love what you're doing. I just think it's so inspiring, and I think the field is lucky to have someone like you in it.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that, and I echo that back to you. I just think this is an amazing forum to have, so really pleased to be part of it.
Awesome. All right, we'll talk soon. Take care.
Definitely. You too. Bye.